Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is, as always, an honour to rise in this House of Commons, and especially honourable today, as this may be the last hour of private members' business before this glorious chamber is shuttered for 10 to 15 years while it receives much-needed renovations. Very soon, it will be shut down for that long. In my opinion, it is fitting that such an important subject as the physical activity of youth could be the last topic for private members' business. It is my sincere hope that when this magnificent building reopens in 10 to 15 years, that we would have had in place a solid federal framework for promoting Canadian youth to be physically active. Mr. Speaker, you have read my motion. It seeks to do three things: to develop strategies to raise the level of physical activity of youth. The advantages of doing so are economic, social, cultural, physical, and mental. Improving the mental health of children also helps make them more resilient in the face of bullying. This motion, Mr. Speaker, for me comes from a personal place. I am the father of 2 young children. I'm also the son of a phys ed teacher. My father, unfortunately, passed away the year I was elected to this chamber and did not get to see me be a member of Parliament. In part, this motion is a tribute to his memory, and that he always taught me to be a good sport, to take part in physical activity, and to make sports part of my childhood. And for that, I will be forever grateful. You see, Mr. Speaker, physically active youth have always known to be healthy. But only recently we realized the health benefits go beyond strong muscles and strong bones. The social benefits are innumerable, Mr. Speaker. New evidence shows now that the mental health benefits are almost as great. Children who are active are more resilient to bullying, less prone to bouts of depression, and have less suicidal thoughts in adolescence and adulthood. All, I think, Mr. Speaker, noble goals that this House should pursue. My motion directs the Health Committee to study the benefits of physical activity in youth. There is a large amount of evidence out there, and it continues to grow. This evidence needs to be brought together, I think, by the committee. The committee, in my assessment and my opinion, should then make recommendations to this House and indicate what role the federal government should play in making sure there's an adequate federal framework that encourages health promotion in our children. Mr. Speaker, I grew up many years ago, and I was always involved in sports, as I mentioned. But I always also played outside with my friends. The norm was we left the house as soon as we could, either on our bikes or running to our friend's house. And as long as we were home when the street lights were on, everything was good. We had lunch at whoever house was closest to us while we were playing road hockey or baseball in an open field or soccer or some other game that we invented. You see, Mr. Speaker, it's these activities that help a young child's brain develop. And not just develop to play sports, but it helps them create motor skills. It helps them deal with social situations. It helps them develop conflict skills, Mr. Speaker. As you know, all of these things are important when people move from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. Mr. Speaker, the evidence, as I said, is copious. It needs to be harnessed, and it needs a federal push. We have done some good work federally in this field. We recently funded Participation to do some research and to promote these activities. There's also recently provincial, territorial, and federal leaders, ministers of sport or whatever the portfolio might be in their jurisdictions, have come together and come up with a great report entitled Let's Get Moving, which has a great amount of suggestions and a framework in which the federal government has a role to play. I suggest this type of evidence is what should be before the Health Committee when they decide what recommendations to make to the House. But, Mr. Speaker, although, in my assessment and my humble opinion, the benefits are indisputable, but we're just not getting where we need to be for whatever reason. And I think the Health Committee can help get us over that hump, so to speak. Participation recently came out with a report card graded with many countries around the world. Canada, in overall physical activity, scored a D+. Active play, a D. Terrible. Active transportation, a D-.
Terrible.
Sedentary behavior, a D+. Physical fitness, D. Schools rated well at B-. Community and environment, B+. And family and peers, C+. The average was C-, Mr. Speaker, which I think everyone in this House agrees we need to do better. Mr. Speaker, the importance of health, the importance of activity in youth, the importance of this subject, I think, comes home doubly when we see throughout Canada, and we're starting to acknowledge it, the issues of mental health and the destigmatization of mental health, which is happening. Mr. Speaker, mental health is a serious issue in this country. I think everyone in this House agrees. It's also particularly serious among our youth. There was a recent study that came out from the Toronto District School Board that compared stress levels of school students in the last 5 years, and the stress levels have increased significantly, so much that some are unable to cope with the environment of being in school, Mr. Speaker. So I think there's a problem that needs to be addressed. I don't think I'll get much disagreement on that. But the evidence is also starting to clearly show that physical activity in young people well equip them to deal with stress, with mental health issues, with PTSD even, Mr. Speaker. And although an American study from a few years ago came with the same conclusion, the doctor of that study, Dr. Sibbald, said, given the substantial current focus on anti-bullying campaigns, it seemed to us that safe, cheap, and efficacious options are sorely needed to mitigate this growing problem. If we can prevent even one child from depression or self-harm, this is worth it, hands down. Well, I couldn't agree more with those sentiments, Mr. Speaker. And bullying also is a problem in our schools, as the Dr. Sibbald alluded to. In my area, we have a group that is very active against bullying, and it does a lot. It's Bully-Free York Region. They do great work. They know that physically active youth are less bullied, and more importantly, or just as importantly, are more able to cope when they are bullied. Mr. Speaker, this is important. I think everyone agrees it's important. Now, I've reached out, as I said, there's much evidence out there, and I've had the opportunity to speak to a lot of stakeholders as I was going through this motion and before our first reading debate here today. A very active group in my riding, Activate Aurora, provided a lot of information. I spoke with people from the Nova Scotia Fitness Centre, Active for Life, of course, Participation, Recreation Canada, and I had the pleasure just last Sunday of meeting Lisa Bowes, who is now a children's author. Some might remember of her days of a sports reporter on TSN, but she's come out with a new line of books entitled Lucy Loves, or Lucy Tries, or Lucy Plays, and whatever sport it might be, hockey, luge. There's a number of books out in this series. And what these books do is encourages you to get involved in sports and to trying new sports, which I think is key, Mr. Speaker. And all of these people are working hard towards the same goal. But unfortunately, as is the case in many organizations in a country as big as Canada, that aren't necessarily working together. They're working, of course, in the phrase working in silos. applies. And I think if we seize this matter as a federal government, direct the Health Committee to do a study, they can break down some of these barriers between the groups, between these groups, share evidence, share best practices, and make some great recommendations that will make Canadians and Canadian children healthier. Now, this, of course, Canadians love organized sports, and there's many great sports associations in all of our ridings, and I encourage all students, all children to get involved, but this doesn't have to be just organized sports, Mr. Speaker. There needs to be, I think, a cultural shift in this country, where students, like I did many years ago as a young child growing up in Queensville, Ontario, just north of the riding I represent now in Newmarket, Aurora, of playing all day, playing without necessarily rules, playing without organizations, without structure. Some use the phrase free-range children in today's nomenclature, but it was the norm back then. It was the norm. And too much today, I think, Mr. Speaker, we've moved away from that into the norm of children can never leave the house. Children need to stay at home where they're safe and protected. You know, we hear of incidences where children are walking down the sidewalk, perhaps to the local park, and neighbors are calling the police to say there's a 9 or 10-year-old girl walking down the street without her parents, as if that was some kind of an emergency, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not necessarily faulting the caller, but it needs to be a cultural shift where that's the norm, where that's great, where that should be encouraged, and where the person who sees that child walking down the street shouldn't phone 911, but should call the parents to thank them for having an active child. And if they're concerned about that child's safety, perhaps watch her for the 80 meters while she walks to the park to make sure she gets there safely. That's the kind of culture I think engenders physical activity in students. You look at countries like Japan. Japan doesn't build schools any further than 4 kilometers apart from the students that go there. Every student in Japan walks to school. In Canada, I believe it's less than 20%, Mr. Speaker. Now, we have geographical limits that Japan may not. But in areas where walking to school, where a school is less than 3 or 4 kilometers, these children should be encouraged to walk to school, to bike to school, to do it in groups. There's this concept of walking buses where you stop at everyone's house and pick another child up as they walk to the school. We need to make this more of the norm and less of the exception. And as I said, it's not just because we need children to be physically active. It's not just because we want children to be healthy. Physically, it's because we want them to be well-rounded adults. We want them to be able to cope with the stress of real life. And a big issue that exists even now that didn't 5, 10, 15 years ago is, of course, and I deal with it every day, believe me, with my especially my 7-year-old, is screen time. Getting these tablets out of a child's hand is almost impossible without strict discipline. And for those who have children, especially a 7-year-old, you know how stubborn they can be. My sons are Colton and Cash. They both can be a little bit stubborn when it comes to this. But you have to set the guidelines. And I'm not going to be here and lecture people on parenting skills. I don't profess to be an expert in that field by any stretch of the imagination. But I can see firsthand that the problem is real. There's more distractions for children now than there was as I was a child. I think I had 4 or 5 channels to choose from, and I might have watched TV Saturday mornings when Scooby-Doo was on.
It was good. We love
It wasn't
Scooby.
black and white, it was color, Mr. Speaker.
We love Scooby.
But these are the types of things, that real-life issues that children are facing today. And when you're replacing screen time, instead of being physically active, then it mitigates that problem. It doubles that problem, actually, and it makes it worse, Mr. Speaker. So my request is a simple one. I truly do hope the House can rally around it. It is a completely nonpartisan one, in my humble opinion. But what we need, Mr. Speaker, is the Health Committee to come to study this, bring the evidence together, come up with recommendations to make sure that the federal government plays its role ensuring our children are healthy, mentally, emotionally, socially. They get to have a fulfilling life, and we as a federal government should set that framework to make that as likely as possible. And I look forward to debate on this matter. I'm hoping to have support across parties, and I really look forward, if my motion is successful, to the great work that the Health Committee will do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.